and many thanks to the ISSN for inviting me to speak today. The title of my talk is Open Access Policy Chess, a four-dimensional game involving academics, institutions, funders and publishers. And in it I hope to demonstrate how progress towards open access has been affected by various policy moves by these four players. This presentation draws on various pieces of research that I've undertaken and some that others have undertaken over the last 15 years relating to copyright and open access. And my research began with the Romeo project back in 2003, which resulted in the Romeo database that you'll probably be familiar with and I'll talk about later on. My research has inevitably had a UK focus, so I apologise for that. I'm seeing this through my own kind of geographical lens, but I'm hoping to draw on an international perspective where I can. So briefly, this game has four players. We have the publishers, and by this I'm referring to journal publishers, academics, scholars, faculty, whatever your term might be for them, universities or research organisations, and research funders. And I'm very aware that there's a danger of overgeneralising when it comes to characterising stakeholder groups. Within each of these sets of players, there's a broad range of approaches, activity, and beliefs. And I'm generalising here to give us a high-level overview and perspective on policy impact. And the aim of this policy game, very broadly speaking, is to enable open access. That is the goal. However, I will return to this point later on. So open access was born, as Jean-Claude and Michael have outlined already, and when open access first became a thing, self-archiving was the main route to achieving it. There was no gold open access journals pretty much at that time. Authors just needed to make a copy of their published articles, either the preprint or the post-print or the accepted manuscript, as we call it now, on the internet in some way. That was open access. So what was stopping academics or their universities from doing this? One word: copyright. They didn't own the copyright in their articles, they had assigned it to publishers. And this was the only legal thing stopping open access. I'm not saying there weren't other technological and cultural issues, but that was the only legal thing stopping open access. And it was due to publisher copyright policies, our first set of policies in this game of chess. And academics had two fears. The first fear was that you wouldn't get published if you'd already self-archived. And the second fear was you couldn't self-archive if you had already been published, a catch-22. And this slide just shows some data from one of the very early Romeo studies for that. I've not included references on each slide, but there is a slide of references at the end, and I'm sure the slides will be circulated. So, if you can move on to the next slide. So the first set of policies in this game were the publisher copyright policies, as embodied by their copyright transfer agreements. And academic authors were right to be nervous. Another of the Romeo studies showed that at the birth of open access, 90% of author-publisher agreements asked for copyright transfer. 69% of those asked for that prior to refereeing the paper. Now that's no longer the case, that's changed, but that was the situation then. And 3/4 asked authors to warrant that their work had not been previously published, this so-called Inglefinger rule introduced by the New England Journal of Medicine. But hang on a minute, why were publishers dictating the path of open access? Who actually owns copyright in the first place? Well, the general rule laid down by the Berne International Copyright Convention is that creators own copyright, artists, filmmakers, playwrights, and in our case, player two, academic authors. However, in some countries, such as the UK and the US, arguably it's player three, the employing institution, although by custom and practice in those countries, copyright has been waived or licensed back to the academics so they can publish where they want. Excuse me. In some countries, UK, Australia, Hong Kong, etc., publishers are given a typographical right, a right over the layout of the finished article, but this only lasts for 25 years, and otherwise copyright belongs to creators. So how did academic authors respond then to publishers' policies? Mute acceptance. Now, don't get me wrong, academics feel very strongly about the ownership of their intellectual property, and most believe that they should own it. However, most also give it away, either freely, 42%, or reluctantly, 49%, as this data from the Romeo project shows, in exchange for publication, something they prize even more highly. Copyright transfer to academics is perceived as either a necessary evil, an avoidable part of scholarly culture, or it's treated like most of us treat click-through licenses. We click to accept, and then we let our own ethics govern our behaviour, rather than any actual understanding of the license. And this is why we see so many academics putting publisher PDFs onto ResearchGate, because they see it as a scholarly norm to share, rather than a copyright infringing activity. So, universities, seeing the problem that academics are giving copyright away to publishers and they're having to buy it back, try to encourage academics to retain their copyright. So Spark created an author addendum that authors could use to try and negotiate copyright retention with publishers, and this did not prove universally successful. They also tried to get them to take advantage of publishers' self-archiving offers, where they did. But studies have shown that left to their own devices, authors massively underuse the opportunities that publisher policies offer. And in some countries now, of course, such as France, Germany and the Netherlands, where they have changed copyright law to give authors a right to self-archive after certain embargo periods, universities try to encourage academics to make use of this. Now, I'm not sure how successful this has been. I'm hoping I might be able to find out today by talking to some of you. But we know that the University of Konstanz in Germany tried to mandate the use of this legislation with their academics, and they were taken to court by their own academic staff. So if the aim of the game is to enable open access, I believe some joined-up approach between universities and their academic staff around copyright ownership needs to happen. And this was the recommendation of that Romeo project back in 2003. So what happened? Did universities change their copyright policies to support their academics to self-archive? No. Did they mandate open access? No. They established policies that encouraged it, and this left academics to continue engaging or not with publisher policies, and the Romeo project that I worked on set up the Romeo database of publisher open access policies to help academics understand those policies and make informed choices about where to publish. So how did this affect publisher open access policies? Well, the Romeo project started to colour code those publisher policies to guide academics towards open access friendly publishers. However, this also started to act as a bit of a publisher rating system. So if a publisher allowed the self-archiving of the preprint, they were yellow. Of the postprint only, they were blue. Both, they were green, the highest prize, and not to be mistaken with the green road to open access, from which this kind of came. There's two slightly different things. Or neither, which is white, so no prize at all, no colour code at all. And this chart maps the Romeo colour codes of all publishers on the Romeo database over time. And you can see that although initially there was a little bit of movement, even growth of green and blue, by 2006, this soon started to decline, and as I'll show later, at the same time, the volume of restrictions around the how and the when and the where of self-archiving began to grow. So it was clear that relying on publisher policies wasn't a long-term solution for open access. So in steps Player 4, the funders. Research funders, irritated by the slow growth of open access and keen to maximise the impact of their funding efforts, began to introduce their own policies that mandated open access. So this is data from RawMap, and just as Romeo maps publisher open access policies, RawMap maps funder and organisational open access policies. You can see that the dark blue lines, which are the funder open access mandates and policies, start in about 2006, virtually exactly the same time as publisher policy support for open access seemed to decline. And by 2018, there were 133 funder open access policies listed on RawMap, the vast majority of which mandate open access rather than request it. So what did they say, these funder policies, Well, they varied, and I've put a selection up here just to give a flavour. There's a lot of them. But the NIH was probably the first big player to kind of request the submission of the author's final manuscript upon acceptance for publication or within 12 months to PubMed Central. And in 2013, the US Office for Science and Technology Policy mandated green open access for all federally funded research outputs, again within an allowable embargo period of 12 months. In the UK, the Wellcome Trust led the way, allowing embargo periods of up to 6 months for green open access, with the RC UK following close upon in 2006. And of course, as Jean-Claude mentioned this morning, the Wellcome Trust and RC UK policies specifically approved the use of grants to pay article processing charges. And after the Finch report, the catastrophe that Jean-Claude mentioned this morning, was published in 2013, which stated a preference for gold over green, the RC UK started to provide dedicated funding to universities, huge swathes of money to pay article processing charges. And this was supposed to enable a transition from green to gold open access, but of course the rest of the world didn't follow suit, and we haven't yet seen that transition. But the biggest driver for open access in the UK was the HEFKI open access policy in 2015, which states that unless an article or conference paper is available in open access, it will not be submittable to the UK's National Research Assessment exercise, the Research Excellence Framework. And again, gold or green are permitted, although items need to be available in the institutional repository within 3 months of the date of acceptance by the publisher, that piece of metadata none of us have, and rather than the date of publication, even though embargo periods of 12 to 24 months are allowed. And as far as I'm aware, this is the only country to date which mandates open access in quite that way. The European Commission now mandates open access for Horizon 2020, again with allowable embargo periods. The Chinese Academy of Sciences, the Australian Research Council, both require deposit within a repository within 12 months. And the reason I've gone through all of those is to kind of draw out 3 distinguishing features of all of these funder policies. One, there are always allowable embargo periods unless the funder is paying the APC. 2, there's a preference for institutional and subject repositories over just posting on the web. And 3, in the UK and some other European countries, a preference for gold over green, or at least an express willingness to fund gold APCs from research grants. So another player has made their move. How do the others respond? Well, the next policy move by universities was at last to mandate open access, and this is data from RawMap again, and it shows the current state of play. Red is research organisations, universities in those columns, and the left-hand bar indicates policies that require open access rather than requesting it, which is the middle bar, and the right-hand bar is not specified at all. But what about those publishers? Well, as funders require or permit more gold open access and permit more embargo periods for green open access, guess what? We see a huge increase in both. So this data shows the growth in the number of restrictions as to where, when and how authors can self-archive, and the number of paid open access, hybrid open access options listed for the original 107 publishers on the Romeo database back in 2004. So the Wayback Machine was my friend too, and we searched back through to 2004 looking for those policies and seeing how they've changed, right up to 2015. And the first thing to note is how complex these policies are becoming. So you can see how many restrictions that individual authors and institutional repository managers are having to deal with on a daily basis. But if we dig into the detail, the red bars there show the growth in the number of when restrictions, mainly embargo periods, and you can see a considerable rise after the NIH Wellcome RC UK policy in 2005 there. And the purple line shows the growth in paid open access options offered by publishers. And again, after the RC UK starts giving money to UK universities for APCs in 2013, you see another spike in publishers offering a gold open access option. If we go to the next slide and we look at the embargo period data more closely, we see a huge increase in embargo periods of lengths that chime with those that funders will allow. So back in 2006, the number of 6 and 12-month embargoes were fairly equally split. But by 2015, 12-month embargoes were the dominant embargo period. But on the face of it, this is a good thing, right? If funder and publisher policies align, it makes it so much easier for academics and universities to comply with them. Well, 2 points to make. Firstly, a question: if funders had not agreed to such embargo periods, would publishers have introduced them anyway, or did funders actually make things worse? And secondly, we have to point out that not all publishers are seeking to comply with funder policies. So most UK funder policies ask for a 6-month embargo for STEM subjects, and this data would suggest that they are less well catered for. And it's interesting to see that although 36-month embargo periods were unheard of up until 2007, by 2008 they become a feature of the open access landscape. On the next slide, we see another example of publishers' lack of support for funder policies in their response to funder demands for green copies to be deposited in repositories where they have a better chance of long-term survival rather than on web pages where they're more ephemeral. So a recent study of ours showed that whilst the number of publishers achieving the so-called Romeo Green status was on the rise, reaching 54% by 2015, the number actually allowing self-archiving on an institutional repository immediately, in line with the kind of Bethesda definition of open access, was on the decline, dropping to 34% by 2015. And this seems to suggest that publishers are playing the system, seeking to market themselves as Romeo Green, whilst not actually enabling coordinated long-term easy access to publications on repositories. Indeed, the percentage of publishers in our study which achieved their green status solely through allowing archiving on web pages was 1/4. And in terms of gold, remember this is a feature of UK policies, and you can see from this data, published just last week actually in Scientometrics, that UK publishers are far more likely to have a gold or paid open access policy than US publishers. And on the next slide, we see some data from a recent study for Universities UK on monitoring the transition to open access. You can see how the majority of journals indexed in Scopus are now gold in some form, with the majority being hybrid, i.e. charging both a subscription and an article processing charge. And for the journals in which UK authors, on the right here, choose to publish, the proportion offering gold is even greater at 70%, with about 60% of that being hybrid. And this is obviously at a considerable additional cost to UK universities. The average APC rose 16% between 2013 and 2016 against a backdrop of a 5% rise in the Consumer Price Index. And by 2016, 1/6 of all payments to journal publishers by UK universities was for article processing charges, mainly for hybrid journals. So, where does this leave us? Policy stack. We have policies from universities, funders and publishers. They contradict, they overlap, they're getting ever more complex. And poor old Player 2, our academic, is buffeted by them all. So what about Player 2, the academic to whom all these policies ultimately apply, the academic who actually holds the power to retain their copyright and set their own destiny, the academic who needs their universities to support to make that happen? Are we any closer to seeing that? Well, I took a look in 2016 at UK universities' copyright policies to find out. And the good news from an open access perspective is that 20% of UK university copyright policies do now seek to share copyright with their academic staff through licensing. So one licenses the other. And the other good news is that these policies which do seek to share copyright are more recent than those that relinquish or claim copyright from academics. And proportionally, it is the research intensives, the Russell Group, that are taking this approach more than others. And this would suggest that it's both a trend and one that other universities, that are perhaps less research intensive, are likely to follow, as they tend to follow the more research intensive institutions. Another way of looking at the policy data was to see which universities sought the specific right to reuse scholarly works for some purposes, such as placing the item in a repository for teaching and research purposes. And a larger proportion, 28%, fell into this category. And again, the mean policy date of those that did was more recent than those that didn't, and it's the research intensives that are more likely to do this. And of course, it's not just UK universities that appear to be moving towards a joined-up approach to copyright licensing to enable open access. In 2008, Harvard University's Faculty of Arts and Sciences famously voted unanimously to adopt an open access license in which academics granted their university a worldwide, non-exclusive, perpetual license to make scholarly works available on their institutional repository. And this license predates and trumps any subsequent license that they may sign with a publisher, although academics can opt out on a paper-by-paper basis if the publisher or co-author requires it. And there are now over 70 US universities with similar licenses. And in the UK, Imperial College London are taking the lead on developing a similar license, still in negotiation, for adoption by the UK HE community. It is called the UK Scholarly Communications Licence, and the key difference here is that the model licence will be adopted by a whole range of universities, a whole community at once, and it seeks to be more restrictive around the allowable opt-outs by academics, mainly to ensure they're meeting all the different demands of those funder policies. This sort of licence chimed with that original suggestion of the Romeo project back in 2003 that enabling open access lies largely in the hands of the academy, academics and their institutions working together to set the framework for open access. So on the face of it, here's the next slide, two players have joined forces and are now playing as a team in this game of chess. How are publishers responding? Well, Harvard are very positive and claim that less than 5% of publishers ask for waivers under their policy, but they are Harvard. Some research in the US shows that the majority, 70% of US universities with these policies, state that they will honour publisher embargoes, despite the fact that their policies should supersede any publisher-imposed restrictions. And this might be why the UK Scholarly Communications Licence is coming under such fire, as it aims to be more restrictive around those opt-outs allowable by academic staff and the embargo periods that they may allow through negotiation. But what about those poor beleaguered academics? What do they think about these policies? Well, a recent survey of US faculty revealed the following. These table of concerns, and again the reference for this is later on in the slides. Their number one concern was that complying with the policy will create a burden on faculty, too much work. The number two concern was that control of copyright was being transferred to the institution and that deposit on IR permits unauthorised use of the works by others. So loss of control and resulting unauthorised use or derogatory use. So protecting their moral rights was an issue. The third concern was a belief that publishers will refuse work if authors are subject to an open access policy. So we're talking again about that status seeking John Claude was talking about earlier. Prestige is intimately linked with journal publication. And number four is a concern, a belief that a mandatory policy is an act of institutional control and coercion, i.e. a loss of academic freedom. There were others, but those were the kind of top four concerns. So these results highlight some of the big ironies around academics, universities, copyright, and open access. And I've written quite a bit about this. It's complicated, but here are three. Number one, academics are concerned about sharing copyright with universities, even though they give it away to publishers. Number two, academics believe their rights, copyright and moral rights, are better protected by publisher policies than university ones. However, there's no evidence that a journal publisher has ever defended an author's rights post-publication. Indeed, when we looked at these policies back in 2003, only 18% of publisher copyright agreements even mentioned moral rights, compared to, how many was it? Double that, I think, when we looked at the university policies. I haven't got the exact number down here. So double the number of university copyright policies sought to protect moral rights when we looked at them in 2015. And finally, number 3, academics see university-imposed policies as an infringement of their academic freedom, but quietly accept those imposed by funders and publishers. And as the retention of copyright is often seen as a barometer of academic freedom, and publishers ask for copyright and universities don't, this is difficult to understand. For some reason, academics seem to believe that their interests align more with publishers than their own institutions. And again, I've written about this and I don't have time to expound here. But in my view, this is the next hurdle to overcome if the academy are to regain some kind of control over their scholarly works and enable open access in the way that we would like without inordinate cost. And this leads me back to the ultimate aim of this open access policy chess game. I said at the outset that the aim of the game was, very broadly speaking, to enable open access. And I also accepted the dangers of overgeneralisation here, namely that all stakeholder groups share exactly the same characteristics. They don't. I'm convinced that within each of these stakeholder groups, there are tranches of individuals who are passionately committed to enabling open access. They are passionately committed to winning the game. However, I do wonder whether this series of moves and counter moves that I've illustrated today is revealing something else about the commitment of these players to enabling open access. I wonder whether what we're actually seeing is players who are not interested in winning the game, nor even necessarily playing the game, but players who feel like they need to be seen to be playing the open access game, supporting open access, without it actually costing them anything. Publishers want to be seen to play the open access game as long as it doesn't cost them their profit margins. Academics want to be seen to play the game, but as long as it doesn't cost them any effort or prestige. Universities want to be seen to play the game, but as long as it doesn't cost them their relationship with their academic staff. And funders want to be seen to play the game, but not at the cost of the complete disruption to the scholarly system. We're still very much tied into journal publishing largely along the existing model, although as Jean-Claude said this morning, hopefully we're starting to see signs of change there. Perhaps this is just human nature, and the need to be seen to be playing the open access game will be enough to get things done in the end. But I certainly think it might help explain the slow progress we are making and why this is probably the world's slowest ever game of chess. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. So we will have Mark now, and I will just make a quick presentation. Why you have to put your, I think you